Hey everyone, this is going to be my Blood DK guide for the War Within Season 2. Blood DK is definitely my favorite tank. It's the tank I've played for years and mained for years. And in my opinion, it's just probably the most fun tank you can play, in my opinion. Blood DK is a very self-reliant tank, as in you do most of the healing for yourself. So keep that in mind. You do get some healing from your healer, of course, like every other tank does. But in general, just because of your defensives and rotation, Blood DK can be a very punishing tank. It is extremely fun to play though, so I highly recommend you guys picking it up and trying it out. But just keep that in mind, your survivability is kind of on you as a Blood DK player. There are two hero talents that you can go from. One is Deathbringer, the other is Sand Lane. We will talk about a little bit of both, but I will be recommending Sand Lane just because of the damage. But just to give you an overview of what each one is, Deathbringer is more of a slower, tankier play style for Blood DK. It also opens up the Reaper's Mark tree, which is another ability, a stack ability that does some damage and also reduces damage incoming to you later on in the tree. But this is just more of a slower, tankier play style. Sand Lane does a lot more damage and is a much faster, kind of almost a life-stealing build. So you will see a lot of Blood DK tank players playing Sand Lane right now, just because it offers so much damage and it offers a lot of what Blood DK players are looking for. Since we're taking Sand Lane, let's go ahead and talk about what it does. Sand Lane really revolves around a Vampiric Strike, which is when your next Death Coil or Death Strike has a 35% chance to make your next Heart Strike become Vampiric Strike. Vampiric Strike heals you for 1% of your maximum health and grants you Essence of the Blood Queen, increasing your haste by 1% up to 7%. So basically what Vampiric Strike is, it actually changes your ability Heart Strike into Vampiric Strike. Now don't get confused, we will talk about your cooldowns later in the video, so don't worry about that. So you will understand what Heart Strike is later. I just like to get through all the talents so that you're set up to know what those cooldowns are after we get through this section. So the next ability on this tree is Vampiric Speed. Death's Advance and Wraith Walk movement speed bonuses are increased by 10%. Activating Death's Advance or Wraith Walk increases 4 nearby allies' movement speed by 20%. I would recommend taking this. Now if you're raiding, you can take Newly Turned, which raises ally revives players at full health and grants you and your ally an absorb shield equal to 20% of your max health. So that's very good for raid. But for keys, you really want that movement speed because DKs are a little bit slower. So I would take Vampiric Speed. Next, we're going to talk about Blood-Soaked Ground. While you are within your D&D, which is D&D stands for Death and Decay, your physical damage taken is reduced by 5% and your chance to gain Vampiric Strike is increased by 5%. So normally it is 35%, now it will be 40 if you're inside your Death and Decay, and all physical damage you take is reduced by 5%, so it's very good. Next, we will be taking Bloody Fortitude, which Icebound Fortitude reduces all damage you take up to an additional 20% based on your missing health. Killing an enemy that yields experience or honor reduces the cooldown of your Icebound Fortitude by 3 seconds. So all in all, when you're doing very big pulls in Mythic Plus, which you do as a tank, especially in Cinderbreed Meadery or Theater of Pain, different mythic keys like that, Bloody Fortitude is fantastic. This is what I would highly recommend taking. Next, we have Infliction of Sorrow. When Vampiric Strike damages an enemy affected by your Blood Plague, it extends the duration of the disease by 3 seconds and deals 20% of the remaining damage to the enemy. After Gift of the Sand Lane ends, your next Heart Strike consumes the disease to deal 130% of the remaining damage to the target. So Frenzied Bloodthirst. Essence of the Blood Queen stacks 2 additional times and increases the damage of your Death Coil and Death Strike by 6%. per stack. The next big node that we'll talk about is the Blood is Life. Vampiric Strike has a chance to summon a Blood Beast to attack your enemies for 10 seconds. Each time the Blood Beast attacks, it stores a portion of the damage dealt. When the Blood Beast dies, it explodes, dealing 35% of the damage accumulated to nearby enemies and healing the Death Knight for the same amount, but it does deal reduced damage beyond 8 targets. Next, we have a Visceral Strength. When Crimson Scourge is consumed, you gain 12% strength for 12 seconds. Insight Terror is when Vampiric Strike and Heart Strike causes your target to take 1% increased shadow damage up to 5% for 15 seconds. Vampiric Strike benefits from Insight Terror at 400% effectiveness. Next, we have Pact of the Sand Lane. You store 50% of the shadow damage dealt to your Blood Beast to explode for additional damage when it expires. So you can kind of see the massive AoE damage that Sand Lane has. Now the last one in the capstone talent is Gift of the Sand Lane. While Dancing Rune weapon is active, you gain Gift of the Sand Lane. Gift of the Sand Lane increases the effectiveness of your Essence of the Blood Queen by 200%, and your Vampiric Strike replaces your Heart Strike for the duration. So you can see having your Dancing Rune weapon off cooldown is extremely important when playing Sand Lane, and we'll talk about how to reduce its cooldown and what Dancing Rune weapon is later in this video. Now that we've talked about hero talents, let's go ahead and talk about the Blood talent tree. This is the generic talent tree that I would highly recommend you guys playing. There is a few things that you can take out if you're struggling for survivability. You can take it away from hemostasis, which hemostasis, each enemy hit by blood boil increases the damage and healing done by their next death strike by 8%, stacking up to 5 times. You can take that away and put it into improved vampiric blood, which vampiric blood's healing and absorb amount is increased by 10% in duration 4%. If you are also really struggling with survivability, you can take it out of Bloodshot, which while Blood Shield is active, you deal 25% increased physical damage. You can take it out of that and put it into Umbilicus Eternus, which is after Vampiric Blood expires, you absorb damage equal to 5 times the damage your Blood Plague dealt during Vampiric Blood. These will be the major 2 things that you can kind of swap out on this tree, will be Bloodshot and Umbilicus, depending on do you need more damage or do you need more survivability. I usually keep it in Bloodshot because it kind of comes down to your rotation. If you're doing your rotation correctly, where Umbilicus kind of gives you a little bit more lenience, but I like to keep it in Bloodshot just for the damage. What I do like about this kind of default talent setting is you do have Rune Tap as well, which Rune Tap reduces all damage you take in by 20% for 4 seconds. It does require a rune, but all in all, I feel like for most tank busters when it comes to bosses, this is basically, you always have a charge or 2 available, so you can use this on almost every tank buster, and it just reduces the massive amount of damage that you would tank from those tank busters. So I usually would run this as a blood DK. You can also take a point out of hemostasis and put in Gorfiend's Grasp, which shadowy tendrils coil around all enemies within 15 yards of a hostile or friendly target, pulling them to the target's location. So basically this is an AoE grip. You can also use it as an AoE stop or interrupt. You can put it in that, or you could take a point out of improved Heart Strike and do the same thing. If you do end up dropping Bloodshot, you can also remove Iron Heart and put it into Bloodied Blade if you are going Umbilicus, just to recoup some of that damage. But all in all, this would be the talent tree that I would be running in general. Now let's go ahead and talk about the Death Knight tree. Now there's a couple obvious ones that you can change for Grip of the Dead, which Death and Decay reduces the movement speed of your enemies within the area by 90%, decaying by 10% every second. You can use this as a kiting tool. I usually like to use this. Now you can swap this out if you want more damage. You can put it into Soul Reaper, which Soul Reaper strikes an enemy for a percent of Shadow Frost damage and afflicts the enemy with Soul Reaper. After 5 seconds, if the target is below 35% health, this effect will explode, dealing additional percent Shadow Frost damage to the target. If the enemy that hits yields experience or honor, dies within the afflicted by Soul Reaper, gain Runic Corruption. Now you can also take out Blood Draw, which is when you fall below 30% health, you drain percent health from nearby enemies. The damage you take is reduced by 10%, and your Death Strike cost is reduced by 10 for 8 seconds. It can occur only every 2 minutes. Now this is a really good defensive ability. Let's say you personally are not struggling with defense abilities, but your team is struggling with magic damage going out. You can take off Blood Draw and put it into Assimilation, which is AMZ, which we'll talk about it later in the cooldown section, is Anti-Magic Zone. Places an Anti-Magic Zone that reduces spell damage taken by party or raid members by 20%. The Anti-Magic Zone lasts for 8 seconds or until it absorbs quite a bit of damage. Now for Assimilation, the amount absorbed by Anti-Magic Zone is increased by 10%, and its cooldown is reduced by 30 seconds. So if you're having to use this more often for your team just to be able to survive, you can take it out of Blood Draw and put it in there. But for now, I would just run Blood Draw. You can also swap out Asphyxiate for like Wraith Walk if you need a little bit more speed boost, or if you need to be able to get out of, all root effects and stuff like that. And it also removes all slow effects. So while you're in Wraith Walk, you cannot be slowed. So you can do that in certain scenarios, but most of the time I just run Asphyxiate because I just feel like it's so much better, and it's an extra stop that you can use for your team. So all in all, there's a few different things that you can change with the Death Knight tree, but all in all, I just feel like this is kind of the best setup for you as of right now. So this is what I would be running. Now that we've discussed your talents, let's go ahead and talk about your UI and understanding the resources that Blood DK has to offer. One of the resources that Blood DK has is called runes. Now these runes, or tokens if you will, recharge over time, so you do have to manage them in a pretty smart way that you do not run out of tokens and are out of tokens consistently. The second resources that Blood DK has is called a runic power, which is basically your build and spend resource. And once you've built up enough runic power, you'll be using that runic power on your Death Strike, which is your main self-healing ability. Now you can say, what is Death Strike? Death Strike focuses dark power with a strike that deals physical damage and heals you for 25% of all damage taken in the last 5 seconds and a minimum 7% of maximum health. So making sure that you are building and spending in a very mindful way is extremely important as a Blood DK, because your self-healing and survival is very much reliant on you as a player. Blood DKs can rely on their healer a little bit depending on how high the key is, but 95% of the time you are relying on yourself and your ability to build and spend runic power correctly without running out of tokens or runic power. So now that we've kind of discussed your UI and what resources you'll be tracking as a Blood DK, let's go ahead and move on to our basic rotation. So for our basic rotation, the most important thing that you can know as a Blood DK is if you have the runic power and you need to Death Strike, always Death Strike. Don't think of it as a basic rotation as in with other tanks or other DPS players. Think of Death Strike as basically your main survival ability. Next, after that, you want to make sure you always have at least 5 stacks of Bone Shield up. Now you could say, what is Bone Shield stacks? Now Bone Shield stacks surround you with a barrier of whirling bones, increasing your armor, so it can greatly help your survivability, and this is your main basic defensive as a Blood DK. Now you could be asking, why only 5 stacks when it goes up to 12? Now with Bone Shield, there is some scaling, and basically after 5 stacks of Bone Shield, there kind of becomes a depreciating value. So having 5 stacks is really a really good position for you as a Blood DK. You can have more obviously, and you will probably build more naturally, but getting to that 5 Bone Shield stacks is a main priority as a Blood DK. Now you can ask, how do I build Bone Shield stacks? There are multiple ways of building Bone Shield stacks. Obviously the one main ability called Marrow Rend, which is when you smash the target dealing physical % damage and generate 3 charges of Bone Shield. Now this does cost 2 runes and 2 runic power, so basically using this ability is a manual way of building Marrow Rend stacks, but there are other ways that are a little bit more efficient in my opinion. But say your Bone Shield stacks are about to fall off and you have no abilities that generate Bone Shield stacks, which we will talk about here in a minute. This is a good manual way to keep that Bone Shield stack timer going. The next ability that produces Bone Shield stacks is called Death's Caress, which is when necrotic tendrils reach out, dealing % shadow damage and applying Blood Plague to your target and generating 2 Bone Shield stacks. So usually you would use this right off the bat off a pool. So say you're running up to a new mob pack, you can use Death's Crest, which is a ranged ability, and you will generate 2 Bone Shield stacks. The next ability that generates Bone Shield stacks is called Dancing Rune Weapon. This will basically be your cooldown that you want to use off CD at all times. It summons a rune weapon for 8 seconds that mirrors your melee attacks and bolsters your defenses. While active, you gain 35% parry chance, and it also helps you generate more runic power much quicker. And because of Insatiable Blade, when a charge of Bone Shield is consumed, the cooldown of Dancing Rune Weapon is reduced by 5 seconds. So basically, you can look at that 2-minute cooldown as a much smaller cooldown because you are basically constantly consuming Bone Shield stacks, whether you're using abilities, which we'll talk about here in a minute, that you can actually force some consumption of Bone Shield stacks, or by melee attacks or damaging abilities towards you as a Blood DK, so that cooldown will be consistently reduced the entire time. So those are the 3 ways that you can generate Bone Shield stacks relatively quickly, which next to Death Strike is your biggest part of your basic rotation as a Blood DK. Now the third part of your basic rotation that I want to talk about is making sure that you have your Blood Plague applied to all enemies in the pack that you've pulled or the boss that you've pulled. Which applying Blood Plague is very easily. All you have to do is hit your Blood Boil ability, which deals % attack power, shadow damage, and infects all enemies 10 yards with Blood Plague. So basically this will be one of your main damage dealers next to Heart Strike / Vampiric Strike, and Death Strike, but making sure that this Blood Plague dot is kept up at all times is a huge damage bonus to us as a Blood DK. And the fourth thing for your basic rotation that you need to make sure that you are always having an uptime on is your D&D or Death and Decay. But your Death and Decay corrupts the targeted ground, causing percent shadow damage over 10 seconds to targets within the area. But you should almost look at it as Consecrate as a paladin, and it is very important to make sure that you are always keeping this on an uptime. Now for the final thing with your basic rotation that I wanted to make sure that I added is that your Heart Strike ability, which instantly strikes the target and one other nearby enemy, causes physical damage and reduces enemy movement speed by 20% for 8 seconds. This will be your main filler ability because it generates 5 runic power plus 2 runic power per additional enemy hit. So this will be your main filler / runic power building ability other than your major cooldowns. Now, if this is procced and you do have Vampiric Strike, which Vampiric Strike is your Death Coil and Death Strike have a 25% chance to make your next Heart Strike become Vampiric Strike. Vampiric Strike heals you for 1% of your maximum health and grants you Essence of the Blood Queen, increasing your haste by 1% up to 5% for 20 seconds. So both of these abilities are the same ability. Vampiric Strike is just when it's procced, but you will be using both of these abilities as filler abilities to generate runic power to use on Death Strike. Now that we've talked about your basic rotation, we're going to go ahead and talk about our cooldowns. Now these will be defensive and offensive cooldowns both together, because I feel like with Blood Decay there are a lot of cooldowns that you're used in combination that are both defensive and offensive. So first off, which we've already talked about a little bit, what I want to talk about a little bit more in depth is Dancing Rune Weapon. Which Dancing Rune Weapon summons a rune weapon for 8 seconds that mirrors a melee attacks and bolsters your defensives. While active, you gain 35% parry chance, and because Insatiable Blade, you generate more runic power. You also generate 5 bone shield stacks, and consume the cooldown of Dancing Rune Weapon is reduced by 5 seconds. I personally like to use Dancing Rune Weapon when I'm about to pull a new pack, because it gives me instant runic power, it gives me instant parry chance. Most importantly, it gives me bone shield stacks, and it gives me just a lot of extra damage for that AoE pool, so that if I need to use Death Strike more often, depending on if it's a bigger pool, I have that RP or runic power available. And another really good ability that I like to talk about after Dancing Rune Weapon, and it's called Tombstone. The reason it's really important to talk about this is because Tombstone consumes up to 5 bone shield charges. For each charge consumed, you gain 6 runic power, and you absorb damage equal to 6% of your maximum health for 8 seconds. So basically you can look at it as a big absorb shield depending on how many bone stacks are consumed, which since you are consuming 5 bone shield stacks, this can drastically reduce your Dancing Rune Weapon CD time. So keep that in mind. Now a big tip that I can give you as well with these two abilities, if you do pop your Dancing Rune Weapon when doing a pull and you only have 5 stacks of bone shield stacks, if you do pop Tombstone, you will go down to 0 bone shield stacks and you will lose all that bonus armor. So you can become very squishy very fast, and that absorb shield may not last very long. So a good idea of using Tombstone is when there's like a tank buster coming, or if there's some sort of bigger hit coming that is very telegraphed as a tank that we know we're going to get hit hard. You can use that so that you aren't going to get absolutely one shot, and you can very quickly build back up those bone shield stacks with various abilities we'll talk about here in a bit. Now the next cooldown that we'll talk about is called Bone Storm, which Bone Storm consumes up to 5 bone shield stacks, which creates a whirl of bone and gore that batters all nearby enemies, dealing % attack power shadow damage every 1 second and healing you for 2% of your maximum health every time it deals damage, up to 10%. Now this does deal reduced damage beyond 8 targets. Now this does last 2 seconds per bone shield charge spent and rapidly generates a bone shield every 1 second. So a little tip I can give you with this cooldown is I would use this basically off CD, because with the Insatiable Blade taunt that we've taken, it does reduce your Dancing Rune Weapon's cooldown quite efficiently, and it does consume 5 bone shield stacks, but it also regenerates those 5 bone shield stacks very quickly after, so you won't feel that massive drop off of tankiness as a Blood DK if you're using Bone Storm instead of Tombstone. So I generally use this off of CD. Now after that cooldown, we have Vampiric Blood. This is going to be one of your biggest defensives as a Blood DK, because Vampiric Blood embraces your undeath, increasing your maximum health by 30% and increases all healing and absorbs received by 30% for 10 seconds. Now, if we pair that with Red Thirst, reduces the cooldown of Vampiric Blood by 2 seconds per 10 runic power spent. Now, because of Death Strike, you will be using 45 runic power each time you use it. So basically, you'll be reducing the Vampiric Blood cooldown by 8 seconds every Death Strike. So Vampiric Blood should be available almost every pool or every other pool. And in my opinion, I would use this off cooldown. Next, after that, we have Abomination Limb, which Abomination Limb sprouts an additional limb dealing % shadow damage over 12 seconds to all nearby enemies. It deals reduced damage beyond 5 targets every 1 second an enemy is pulled into your location. If you are further than 8 yards from you, the same enemy can only be pulled once every 4 seconds. So basically, if there are enemies standing a little bit farther out of range of you, they will be almost death gripped in, which we will talk about death grip here in a bit for our utility cooldowns, but it will be pulled into your massive AoE damaging ability. And a little bonus when it comes to Abomination Limb is because of Bone Collector, when you're pulling in enemies, especially when you're using Abomination Limb as an opener, you will be generating Bone Shield stacks passively while the CD is going. Now after that, we have AMS, which is Anti-Magic Shell. Now Anti-Magic Shell surrounds you with a shell for 5 seconds, absorbing up to a % health magic damage and preventing application of harmful magical effects. And the damage that is absorbed generates runic power. Now this is a personal anti-magic shell. I know there are talents that you can take that will put it on someone else, but with the build that we have, we don't have that at the moment. So this is a very personal defensive. Next we have AMZ, which AMZ places an anti-magic zone that reduces spell damage taken by party or raid members by 20%. Next we have Lichborn, which draws upon an unholy energy to become undead for 10 seconds, increasing your leech by 6% and make you immune to charm, fear, and sleep effects. Now because we do take Unholy Endurance, which increases the duration of your Lichborn by 2 seconds, and while active damage taken is reduced by 50%. We also do take Death's Messenger, which reduces the cooldown of Lichborn and Raise Dead by 30 seconds. The Lichborn is another one of those abilities just like Vampiric Blood. You can use it pretty consistently throughout the dungeon, so do not be afraid to use this cooldown. Now after that, we have Icebound Fortitude, which your blood freezes, granting immunity to stun effects and reducing all damage you take by 30% for 8 seconds. Now this is your biggest damage reduction ability, and especially if you're running Cinderbrew Meadery and you're about to do the very first big lust pool on Cinderbrew Meadery, just don't be afraid to use this bigger cooldown if you're doing a bigger pool or if there's going to be a big tank buster on its way. Next we have Rune Tap, which Rune Tap reduces all damage taken by 20% for 4 seconds. Now this does require 1 rune and 10 runic power, and it does have 2 charges. And finally, for our last defensive / offensive cooldown is called Purgatory. Purgatory is an unholy pact that prevents fatal damage, instead absorbing incoming healing equal to damage prevented lasting 3 seconds. If any healing absorption remains when this effect expires, you will die. This effect may only occur every 4 minutes. So basically you can look at this ability as a cheat death. Almost every Blood DK that I've ever known runs this passive talent in your talent tree. We also do run it in the build that I have presented you guys in this video. So keep in mind, if this pops, you will visually know it on your screen that your Purgatory has popped, or if you're monitoring this ability. Now that we've talked about all your offensive and defensive cooldowns, let's go ahead and talk about your utility cooldowns. Now the first utility cooldown that comes to mind is called Asphyxiate. Asphyxiate lifts the enemy target off the ground, crushing their throat with dark energy and stunning them for 5 seconds. Now this ability is a little bit of a longer cooldown, but it is almost like a Hodge for Paladin, so you can look at it in the same way. It is a single target CC or interrupt if you need it. Next we have is Death Grip. Now Death Grip is something we were talking about a little bit with Abomination Limb that happens there too. Death Grip is when you harness the energy that surrounds and binds all matter, drawing the target towards you. So basically you can look at it as a single target grip, which pulls that target into melee range to you, but it also stops interrupts and CCs them for a very short time. Now there are talents that you can run where you death grip someone, they are slowed, but mainly you'll be using this as a way to pull mobs in or just to stop their casts. Also keep in mind that we are running a talent that gives us 2 charges of this. Next we have Death's Advance. Now this will be your main mobility spell, and unfortunately for Blood DK, we are a very slow class, but Death's Advance does help with this a little bit and give us a few passives that are extremely nice. So Death's Advance, for 10 seconds, your movement speed is increased by 35%. You cannot be slowed below 100% of your normal speed, and you are immune to movement effects and knockbacks. So there are a lot of knockbacks, especially with tanks, especially if Cinder Meteor. Use that as an example again. The boss will do Cake Smash and it knocks you back. You can actually Death Advance this and it won't knock you back at all, which is very nice. And we do run a talent that gives us 2 charges of this, so you will have 2 charges. And basically this will always be off cooldown because we are such a slow class. Next, we have a Blinding Sleet. Blinding Sleet is when targets in a cone in front of you are blinded, causing them to wander disoriented for 5 seconds. Now damage may cancel this effect as well, and when Blinding Sleet ends, enemies are slowed by 50% for 6 seconds. Now this will be your main AoE, interrupt, or CC, so make sure you are using this in the correct fashion. After that, we have Raise Ally, which pours dark energy into a dead target, reuniting spirit and body to allow the target to re-enter battle with 60% health and at least 20% mana. So basically this is your B-Res, but it does cost 30 runic power, so keep Blood DK. Next, we have Gorfiend's Grasp, which is a 2-minute cooldown AoE CC ability, with shadowy tendrils coil around all enemies within 15 yards of hostile or friendly target, pulling them to the target's location. So say you have one mob that's pulled into you, you can Gorfiend's Grasp, pull everyone into you, and CC them. Now for the final section of this video, I want to talk about stat priority. So stat priority is pretty simple for Blood DK. Obviously, item level above all else. For your first stat, I would prioritize versatility because it increases your damage, which also increases your healing. And because of how versatility works in World of Warcraft, the higher versatility you have, the less damage you will receive. Next, I would take mastery as a stat priority because of your passive blood shield. It helps you mitigate a lot of the physical damage, which is a lot of the damage that you will be taking as a Blood DK in Mythic Plus. And because we have so much magic mitigation, we have AMZ, we have AMS, magic damage isn't a huge factor as a Blood DK, but it's more physical damage for us because we really only have Bone Shield as armor or flat damage reduction abilities. So Mastery is a very good stat for Blood DK when paired with your passive Blood Shield. And for your third stat priority, I would say haste. Since we are running Sand Lane, we have so much haste to build or passives that help us keep our haste high. So if you're stacking haste on haste, you're just kind of losing out a lot of damage, a lot of healing with versatility, and especially a lot of damage mitigation with mastery. So if you are running Sand Lane, haste is definitely on the low totem pole of stat priority. I would definitely go versatility, mastery, then haste. A little bit of haste isn't too bad. But if you were running a different hero talent, haste would be much more prioritized. But since we're saying lane, we really don't have to prioritize it with damage mitigation. But that's all I have for you guys. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you sub to the channel, follow me on TikTok and Instagram, and I stream on Twitch and YouTube. So if that's something you're interested in, feel free to stop in. But thank you everyone for your support, and I will see you guys on the next video.